Steve Harvey had faced down hostile audiences in dive bars, survived homelessness in his 20s, built and lost fortunes, endured public divorces, and stood on stages in front of millions without flinching. But on that Thursday afternoon in his Atlanta home office, staring at his phone like it contained a live grenade, the 66-year-old comedian couldn't make his thumb press the play button. The voicemail had been sitting in his saved messages for 7 years, and he hadn't listened to it once since the day after his mother's funeral. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Outside his window, the Georgia sun blazed through the trees surrounding his estate, casting shadows that danced across the hardwood floor. His assistant had left for the day. The house was silent, except for the distant hum of the air conditioning and his own ragged breathing. He'd built this empire, the talk shows, the game shows, the books, the sold-out comedy tours, partly as a tribute to Eloise Vera Harvey, the woman who'd raised him in Cleveland with nothing but faith, determination, and an iron will, and partly because he was terrified of becoming the failure she'd once worried he might be. If you've ever lost someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself, you need to hear this story. Share it with someone who needs to remember that a parent's love never really leaves us, and stay until the end. What Steve discovers in that voicemail will break your heart and put it back together in the same breath. You gonna listen to that thing, or you gonna keep staring at it like it's gonna bite you? Steve jerked his head up to find his older brother Terry standing in the doorway, arms crossed, that familiar mix of concern and challenge on his face. Terry Harvey had always possessed an uncanny ability to appear exactly when Steve was wrestling with something he didn't want to confront. "How'd you get in here?" Steve asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Shirley let me in before she left. Said you'd been locked in here for 3 hours. Terry moved into the room, his movements slower than Steve remembered. They were both getting older, though neither liked to acknowledge it. "Oh, what's going on, little brother?" Steve looked back at the phone, found Mama's last voicemail, the one she left the day before her stroke. Terry's expression shifted immediately, the challenge melting into something more complex. Grief, maybe, mixed with understanding. "Jesus, Steve, you kept that?" Couldn't delete it, but couldn't listen to it either. Steve set the phone down on his desk like it might explode. 7 years, Terry. 7 years I've been carrying this thing around, backing it up every time I get a new phone, making sure it never gets lost. But I can't hear her voice. Why now? Terry settled into one of the leather chairs facing Steve's desk. "Why are you thinking about it today?" Steve leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "Got a call this morning from Marcus Freeman. You remember him? Mama's pastor at Mount Sinai?" "Sure, good man. He wants to do a memorial service. 7-year anniversary. Asked if I'd speak, share some memories." Steve's voice dropped. "How am I supposed to stand up there and talk about Mama when I can't even listen to her last voicemail?" Terry was quiet for a moment, studying his younger brother with the kind of penetrating gaze that only siblings can manage. Seeing past the celebrity, the success, the carefully constructed public persona to the scared kid from Cleveland who used to stutter so badly he could barely order food at restaurants. "You know what your problem is?" Terry finally said. "I'm sure you're about to tell me. You think if you listen to that voicemail, you're gonna fall apart. And Steve Harvey can't fall apart. Steve Harvey gotta be strong, gotta be the man, gotta keep it together for everybody else. The comedian, the motivator, the guy with all the answers." Terry leaned forward. "But maybe Mama's last message wasn't meant for Steve Harvey, the celebrity. Maybe it was meant for Broderick, her baby boy, and maybe Broderick needs to hear it." Steve flinched at the sound of his birth name. He'd left Broderick Stephen Harvey behind decades ago, buried him under stage lights and television cameras and the armor of success. But Terry was right. Mama had never called him Steve. To her, he was always Broderick, or baby, or son. "What if I can't handle it?" Steve asked quietly. Then you fall apart. And then you put yourself back together. That's what Mama taught us, remember? Fall down 7 times, get up 8. Before Steve could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and felt his jaw tighten. "It's Darnell." Terry's expression darkened. "Your cousin Darnell? The one who's been—" "Yeah, that one." Steve declined the call, but the damage was done. The tentative vulnerability of the moment shattered against the sharp edges of family conflict that had been brewing for months. Darnell Harvey was Steve's cousin on his father's side, and for the past year he'd been waging a quiet campaign of resentment disguised as concern. It had started innocently enough, comments at family gatherings about how Steve had gotten too big for his roots, how success had changed him, how he'd forgotten where he came from. But lately, Darnell's criticism had become more pointed, more public. He'd given interviews to gossip sites claiming Steve had abandoned his extended family, refused to help relatives in need, and betrayed his mother's values by becoming just another rich celebrity who forgot about the little people. None of it was entirely true, but none of it was entirely false either. Steve had drawn boundaries with extended family after too many people had treated him like a personal ATM. He'd been burned by relatives who'd exploited his generosity, stolen from him, sold stories about him to tabloids. So yes, he'd pulled back, become more selective about who he helped and how. But Darnell was twisting that self-preservation into something uglier, painting Steve as a heartless success story who'd abandoned his roots. "He's been calling all week," Steve muttered. "Heard about the memorial service. Wants to speak at it. Wants to talk about how Mama would be disappointed in the man I've become." "That's garbage," Terry said flatly. "Mama was proud of you. You know that." "Do I?" The words came out sharper than Steve intended. "Last real conversation I had with her, Terry. We fought. About money, about family, about me setting boundaries. She said I was being too hard, too cold. Said family is supposed to stick together no matter what, and I said—" His voice cracked. "I said that family is supposed to respect each other too, not just take and take and take." And she got quiet. That disappointed quiet that was worse than yelling. 2 days later, she had the stroke. The confession hung in the air between them. Steve had never told anyone about that fight, had carried the guilt like a stone in his chest for 7 years. The voicemail on his phone had been left the day after that argument, and he'd been too afraid to listen, because what if it was her telling him she was disappointed? What if her last words to him were disappointment? Terry stood up and moved around the desk, placing a hand on Steve's shoulder. "Brother, you're doing what you always do, carrying weight that ain't yours to carry. Mama loved you. Whatever was in that voicemail, it ain't gonna be what you're afraid of. I guarantee it." "You don't know that." "I know Mama, and I know she understood why you set boundaries, even if she didn't always agree. She raised us to be strong, to protect ourselves, to know our worth. You were living out her lessons, even when she questioned it." Terry squeezed his shoulder. "But you gotta hear her voice again, Steve. You gotta let her back in." Steve nodded, not trusting his voice. Terry left shortly after, extracting a promise that Steve would at least think about listening to the voicemail. But as the afternoon faded into evening, Steve found himself doing everything except thinking about it. He returned emails, reviewed contracts, watched clips of his recent Family Feud episodes, called his wife Marjorie to chat about dinner plans, anything to avoid the phone sitting on his desk like an accusation. It was nearly midnight when he finally picked it up again. The house was completely silent now, just him and his thoughts, and the ghost of his mother's voice trapped in digital memory. His thumb hovered over the play button. "Come on, Broderick," he whispered to himself. "Man up." He pressed play. The sound quality was poor. She'd called from her old landline, and there was static that made her voice sound far away and fragile. But it was unmistakably her, Eloise Harvey, with that particular cadence that combined Ohio practicality with deep wells of feeling. "Hey, baby, it's Mama. I know you're probably busy, doing one of your shows or your meetings or whatever it is you do all day. Too busy for your old mama, I bet." Steve's breath caught. There was teasing in her voice, but also something else. A thread of hurt he'd been too angry to hear when the voicemail first arrived. "Listen, about yesterday, about our conversation. I've been thinking about it all night, praying on it, and I need to say something to you, son. You were right." Steve sat up straighter, his heart hammering. "You were right about the boundaries, about protecting yourself. I was wrong to push you about helping every cousin and uncle who comes asking. Your daddy and me, we raised you kids with nothing, and maybe because of that, I got this idea that family means saying yes to everything, means sacrificing yourself no matter what. But that ain't fair to you, baby. That ain't fair to ask." Her voice wavered, and Steve heard her take a shaky breath. "I'm proud of you, Broderick. I'm so proud I could burst. You took nothing, less than nothing, and built yourself into something amazing. Not just the money or the fame, but the man you are. Kind, generous, faithful, hardworking. You give so much already to so many people, and I had no right to make you feel bad about taking care of yourself and your family first. That's what a man is supposed to do. That's what I taught you to do." Steve's vision blurred with tears. "So I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry for making you feel guilty. I'm sorry for not seeing how hard you work to take care of everybody. And I want you to know something. Are you listening?" There was a pause, as if she was waiting for him to answer across time and death. "I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever comes, you don't owe nobody nothing except what you choose to give. You hear me? You don't have to prove yourself to me or your cousins or anybody. You already made me prouder than any mama has a right to be, so you take care of you. You set them boundaries. You protect your peace. And you know that your mama loves you exactly as you are, not for what you can do for other people." Her voice softened even further, becoming almost a whisper. "I love you, baby boy. I love you so much it hurts sometimes. You go do great things today. And call me when you can, okay? Not because you have to, but because you want to. That's all I ever wanted, just to hear your voice and know you're happy. Okay, bye now, son. Bye now." The message ended with a soft click. Steve sat frozen, tears streaming down his face as the automated voice offered to replay, save, or delete the message. He pressed replay and listened again, then again. Each time he heard new layers, the love in her voice, the wisdom in her words, the blessing she'd given him to be imperfect and still beloved. She hadn't been disappointed. She'd been proud. She'd understood. By the fourth replay, Steve was sobbing openly, the kind of deep, wrenching cries that come from a place beyond performance or control. All the grief he'd held back for 7 years came pouring out, not just for his mother's death, but for all the years he'd spent trying to be perfect, trying to prove himself worthy of her pride, trying to be enough for everyone who wanted a piece of him. He cried until he had nothing left, then sat in the silence of his office, feeling strangely light. The voicemail hadn't destroyed him, it had freed him. Around 2 in the morning he finally stood up and walked to his bedroom. Marjorie was still awake, reading in bed, and she took one look at his face and opened her arms. Steve collapsed into them, and she held him while he told her everything. The fight, the guilt, the voicemail, the blessing he'd been too afraid to receive. "She set you free," Marjorie said softly, stroking his head. "She gave you permission to be human." "I wasted 7 years," Steve said. 7 years I could have heard that, could have known. You heard it when you were ready to hear it. That's how these things work, baby. You couldn't have received that message 7 years ago. You needed to carry the weight a little longer before you were ready to put it down. Steve nodded against her shoulder, feeling the truth of it. 7 years ago, he'd been too raw, too defensive, too consumed by the need to justify his choices. Now, with time and perspective, he could hear what his mother had really been saying. "I see you. I understand you. I release you from the obligation to be perfect." The next morning, Steve called Pastor Freeman and agreed to speak at the memorial service. Then he did something harder. He called Darnell. His cousin answered on the third ring, his voice immediately defensive. "Steve, finally returning my calls. Darnell, I want you to speak at Mama's memorial." Silence on the other end. "Then what?" "I want you to share your memories of her, your perspective on who she was, what she meant to the family. I think it's important." You're serious?" Darnell's suspicion was audible. "This ain't some trick?" "No trick. But I need you to hear something first. Can you listen for a minute without interrupting?" "I guess." Steve took a deep breath. "I know you think I abandoned the family. That success changed me, made me cold. And maybe you're partly right. I did pull back. I did set boundaries that hurt people's feelings. But Darnell, I was drowning. Every day, someone wanted something from me. Money, jobs, connections, just pieces of me. And I was giving and giving until there was nothing left for my own wife and kids. So yeah, I drew some lines, and I know that made people angry. Steve, let me finish. I'm not asking you to agree with every choice I made. I'm not even saying all my choices were right. But I need you to understand that I'm human. I make mistakes. I disappoint people, and that's okay. Mama taught me that. In her last voicemail, his voice caught. She told me it was okay to protect myself, to not carry everybody else's expectations, and I need to believe her, Darnell. I need to stop trying to be perfect for everyone. There was a long pause, then Darnell's voice came back, softer. "She really said that?" "Yeah, she did." Another pause. I've been hard on you, man. Real hard. And maybe some of it was jealousy, if I'm being honest. You got out, you made it, and the rest of us, we're still here, still struggling, still trying to figure it out. And it's easier to be mad at you than to deal with our own stuff." "I get it," Steve said. "I do. But Darnell, here's the thing. I can help family. I want to help family. But it's got to be on terms that don't destroy me. It's got to be mutual respect, not just taking. Can we figure out what that looks like?" "Yeah," Darnell said quietly. "Yeah, I think we can try." The memorial service 2 weeks later was held at Mount Sinai Baptist Church in Cleveland, the same church where Eloise Harvey had spent 40 years singing in the choir and teaching Sunday school. The building was packed, family, old friends, community members who remembered the woman who'd raised 4 kids on a coal miner's salary and never let poverty steal her dignity or faith. Steve sat in the front row between Terry and Marjorie, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on his back. He'd spoken at countless events, hosted shows in front of millions, but this felt different. This felt like standing naked in front of everyone who'd known him before he became Steve Harvey, when he was just Broderick, the skinny kid with the stutter who wanted to make people laugh. Pastor Freeman spoke first, sharing memories of Eloise's faith, her service, her unwavering belief that God had a plan, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Then Terry spoke, telling stories about their childhood that had the congregation laughing and crying in equal measure. Then it was Darnell's turn. Steve watched his cousin walk to the podium, wondering what he would say, whether the tentative peace they'd reached would hold under the pressure of this public moment. "Aunt Eloise was a lot of things," Darnell began, his voice steady. "Tough, faithful, stubborn as all get out when she believed something." Laughter rippled through the church. But most of all, she was proud. Proud of her kids, her family, her faith. "And I want to talk about one thing in particular, how proud she was of my cousin Steve." Steve felt his throat tighten. "Now, I ain't gonna lie. There was a time I resented Steve's success. Felt like he'd forgotten us, left us behind. But I was wrong about that. Steve didn't forget where he came from. He just had to figure out how to honor his roots without being buried by them. And Aunt Eloise understood that, even when the rest of us didn't. She knew her son had to build something strong enough to carry not just himself, but everyone he could reach with his gifts. and she gave him permission to do that, even when it meant disappointing some people along the way. Darnell looked directly at Steve. Aunt Eloise told me once, about a month before she passed, that Steve was living proof that faith and hard work could overcome anything. She said she'd die happy, knowing that at least one of her babies had broken free from the cycle of poverty and struggle that had defined our family for generations. So, Steve, if you're carrying any guilt about not being enough, about not doing enough, about disappointing Mama in any way, let it go, cousin. She was proud. She was so proud. And by the time Darnell finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. Steve stood and embraced his cousin at the podium, the two men holding each other while the congregation witnessed the healing of a family wound that had festered too long. Then it was Steve's turn to speak. He approached the podium slowly, pulled out his phone, and held it up. "This," he said, his voice amplified through the church sound system, "is my most precious possession. More valuable than my houses or my cars or my Emmy Awards, this is the last voicemail my mama ever left me." The church went silent. I didn't listen to it for 7 years. 7 years, because I was afraid. Afraid that I'd hear disappointment. Afraid that I'd failed her somehow. Afraid that I wasn't the son she wanted me to be. Steve paused, gathering himself. But 2 weeks ago, I finally pressed play. And what I heard was grace, was freedom, was a mother telling her son that he didn't have to be perfect to be loved, that he didn't have to carry everyone's expectations to be worthy, that she was proud of him exactly as he was. He looked out at the faces watching him, family, friends, strangers, drawn by his celebrity. Mama taught me a lot of things: how to work hard, how to have faith when circumstances say give up, how to laugh even when life ain't funny. But the last thing she taught me, the final lesson she left me, was this: you can't love everybody into wholeness. You can't sacrifice yourself into saving people. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect your peace and let other people carry their own weight. Steve's voice grew stronger. That doesn't mean abandoning family. It doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means honoring yourself enough to build something sustainable, something that lasts, something that can actually help people over the long term instead of burning out in a blaze of martyrdom. He pressed play on the voicemail, and Eloise Harvey's voice filled the church through the sound system. People wept openly as they listened to her words of pride, of release, of unconditional love. When it ended, Steve looked up with tears streaming down his face. "Mama, I hear you now. I hear you telling me I'm enough, that I always was enough, that I don't have to prove anything to anyone, including you. And I want to make you a promise. I'm going to live like I believe that. I'm going to set boundaries without guilt. I'm going to help people without destroying myself. I'm going to love family while also loving myself. Because that's what you taught me in the end, that loving others starts with honoring the person God made me to be." The church erupted in amens and applause. Steve stood at the podium, feeling something shift inside him, a release of weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For 7 years, he'd been performing strength, hiding his grief and guilt behind comedy and busyness and the relentless demands of celebrity. But in this moment, standing in his mother's church and sharing her final gift with the people who'd known him longest, he was finally just Broderick. Imperfect, grieving, growing, and enough. After the service, there was a reception in the church basement where people shared food and stories. Steve found himself surrounded by relatives he hadn't seen in years, and instead of the usual tension about money or favors, there was genuine warmth. Darnell's public words had shifted something in the family dynamic, given others permission to see Steve as human rather than as an ATM or a trophy. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Steve found himself alone at a table with Terry. His brother was working on a piece of sweet potato pie, But he set down his fork and looked at Steve with something like wonder. "You did good today, little brother." "Feels like I finally said goodbye to her," Steve said quietly. "Really said goodbye. For 7 years I was holding on to her through that voicemail, too afraid to let her go, but also too afraid to really hear what she was saying. Now, I don't know. I feel lighter. That's what forgiveness does. Whether it's forgiving others or forgiving yourself, it lifts the weight." Terry gestured with his fork. "You think you'll be okay now? With the family stuff, the boundaries, all of it?" Steve considered the question. "I think so. I mean, it won't be perfect. People will still get disappointed sometimes when I say no. There will still be conflicts and hurt feelings and all the messy reality of family. But I don't have to carry guilt about that anymore. Mama released me from that. And now I'm releasing myself." "Good," Terry said simply. He took another bite of pie, then added, "You know what Mama would say right now if she was here?" "What?" "She'd say, 'That's nice, boys, but when are you going to give me some grandbabies to spoil?'" Terry's imitation of their mother's voice was spot on, and both brothers burst out laughing, the kind of laughter that comes from shared history and the relief of tension finally broken. They sat there for another hour, trading stories about their mother, some hilarious and some heartbreaking, until the church custodian politely suggested they might want to finish up so he could close the building. As they walked to their cars in the parking lot, the Cleveland evening settling into that particular quality of light that Steve had always associated with home, Terry pulled him into a hug. "Love you, brother. I'm glad you finally heard what she was saying." "Me too," Steve said. "Me too." That night, back in his Atlanta home with Marjorie beside him, Steve played the voicemail one more time. But this time, instead of grief or guilt, he felt gratitude. His mother had given him so much in life: faith, work ethic, resilience, humor. But perhaps her greatest gift had come at the end: permission to be imperfect, to set boundaries, to love himself while loving others. "You okay?" Marjorie asked, watching him with concern. "Better than okay," Steve said, setting down the phone. "I feel free." The next morning, Steve returned to work, taping Family Feud episodes, recording radio shows, preparing for his next comedy tour. But something had shifted. He found himself more present, more genuine, less concerned with maintaining the perfect image of Steve Harvey the celebrity, and more comfortable being Broderick the man. When contestants on Family Feud talked about their families, he listened with new depth. When callers to his radio show asked about setting boundaries with loved ones, he spoke from hard-won experience. And when opportunities came to help family members, he approached them with clearer eyes, saying yes when it made sense, saying no without guilt when it didn't, and trusting that real love could survive honest boundaries. 3 months after the memorial service, Steve was in his dressing room before a show taping when his assistant brought in the mail. Among the fan letters and business correspondence was a simple card with a Cleveland return address. He opened it to find a note from Darnell. "Cousin, I wanted you to know that I started seeing a therapist, working on my own stuff instead of projecting it onto you. It's hard, but it's good. Thank you for showing me that asking for help isn't weakness, and that family can love each other while also respecting boundaries. Aunt Eloise raised some good men. Let's honor her by being the best versions of ourselves. D." Steve read the note twice, then carefully placed it in his wallet next to a small photo of his mother. These were his treasures now, not the symbols of success or celebrity, but the markers of healing and growth. The voicemail that had freed him from guilt, the cousin who'd found the courage to change, the memory of a woman who'd loved him enough to release him from the prison of perfection. Years later, when Steve Harvey told this story on his talk show, and he did eventually, because stories are meant to be shared, he would say that hearing his mother's last voicemail saved his life. Not in the dramatic sense of preventing suicide or catastrophe, but in the quieter, deeper sense of preventing him from living a half-life defined by guilt and impossible expectations. "My mama gave me 2 births," he told his audience, his voice thick with emotion. "The first one brought me into this world, but the second one, that voicemail, brought me into myself. It taught me that I could be loved without being perfect, that I could set boundaries without being selfish, that I could honor my family while also honoring myself. And that's a gift I try to give other people now, because Lord knows we all need permission to be human." The audience erupted in applause, many of them crying, recognizing their own struggles in his story. And Steve stood there, no longer afraid of tears or vulnerability or the messy reality of being human, grateful for a mother wise enough to leave him not just memories of the past, but a blueprint for the future. Because that's what real love does. It doesn't demand perfection or self-sacrifice. It sees you completely, flaws and all, and says, "You are enough. You always were enough. Now go live like you believe it." And finally, 7 years after her death, and 7 years into his journey of healing, Steve Harvey did exactly that.